A fatal stunt only kills the body, but 1950s. Hollywood knew how to execute a man's identity. Tab Hunter was the ultimate American cowboy. Millions worshipped him. Yet, behind the rugged smile, he was a terrified hostage, hiding a massive gay secret. One accidental police raid handed his studio bosses a loaded gun. They didn't protect him. They weaponized his arrest record into a ruthless system of corporate blackmail. Step out of line and face instant professional death. Trapped in a multi-million-dollar cage, he lived in a state of permanent panic. To keep the profitable superstar alive on the silver screen, the real man had to be buried, dead. Before he was a multi-million-dollar commodity, he was Arthur Andrew Kelm. He was an authentic working-class youth who grew up shoveling manure at stables to pay for riding lessons. He even joined the Coast Guard at 15 to escape a difficult home life. Ironically, Hollywood ignored his genuine equestrian skills. The machinery of the studio required polish and total control. The systematic erasure of Arthur Kelm began when he met talent agent Henry Wilson. Wilson scouted for raw physical perfection. He saw the young man not as a person, but as a blank canvas. The name Arthur Kelm was discarded immediately for lacking box office appeal. Wilson arbitrarily decided to tab him with the catchy name Tab and added Hunter to sound masculine. This was not a mere stage pseudonym. It was a corporate trademark. When the young man signed his contracts with Warner Brothers, the studio claimed absolute ownership of the Tab Hunter name, his image, and his revenue. Arthur Kelm had to operate as an employee of his own fabricated identity. He was forced to maintain a constant state of hypervigilance, ensuring his true self never slipped into the aggressively heterosexual image owned by the studio. With the legal rights to the name secured, the Warner Brothers publicity department faced a daunting architectural task. They had to build an impenetrable fortress around their new investment. The cultural climate of the 1950s was merciless. The American public demanded absolute conformity to traditional gender roles, and any deviation was met with swift societal and professional ruin. The studio executives knew that a whisper of their star's true sexuality would instantly annihilate his box office value. Therefore, they needed a disguise so thick, so culturally unassailable, that no one would dare question the masculinity of the man wearing it. The solution was the Hollywood Western. The Western film was not just a genre of entertainment during this era. It was a highly effective tool for cultural engineering. The cowboy was the undisputed pinnacle of rugged American virility. By repeatedly thrusting this young man into leather saddles and strapping revolvers to his hips, the studio was engaging in a calculated act of misdirection. Many film historians note that casting him in these roles was a deliberate defensive strategy. When audiences saw him surviving blistering desert shootouts and taming wild horses, their minds automatically assigned him the traits of his characters. The dust, the sweat, and the stage violence served as a visual shield. It was a brilliant, cynical manipulation of audience perception. The physical reality of maintaining this facade was grueling. Filming these westerns was not glamorous work. It involved long, punishing hours under the harsh California sun or in suffocating sound stages. The studio demanded physically demanding performances, often pushing actors to perform dangerous maneuvers on horseback with minimal safety protocols. While the on-screen cowboy appeared invincible, the actor playing him was frequently exhausted, nursing injuries, and operating under the immense pressure of carrying a multi-million-dollar production. He had to project supreme alpha male confidence while internally battling the constant gnawing anxiety that his true self might be exposed at any moment. The physical exhaustion of the set was compounded by the psychological exhaustion of the closet. Yet the performance did not end when the director called cut. In fact, the most demanding acting required of him took place entirely off-screen. The studio's control extended far beyond the studio gates. It colonized his private life. To solidify the heterosexual illusion constructed by the Westerns, the Warner Brothers publicity machine manufactured a completely synthetic romantic history. They understood that the teenage girls buying movie tickets needed to believe he was available, desirable, and aggressively pursuing the leading ladies of the day. Therefore, the studio mandated a series of highly publicized, entirely fabricated romances. This was not a matter of gentle suggestion. It was an industrial mandate. Studio fixers and his agent Henry Wilson operated like tactical commanders. They orchestrated dates with rising starlets such as Natalie Wood and Debbie Reynolds. The mechanics of these dates were meticulously choreographed. The publicity department would select the restaurant, pay the bill in advance, and inform the paparazzi of the exact time and location of the couple's arrival. The young actor was simply instructed to pick up his assigned co-star, smile warmly at the flashbulbs, and hold her hand as they walked into a movie premiere. A number of sources indicate that some of these actresses were fully aware of the arrangement, acting as willing participants in a mutually beneficial publicity stunt. They were all young workers trying to survive the same ruthless system. The sheer volume of staged imagery pumped into fan magazines created a deafening cognitive dissonance for the young actor. He was constantly confronted with fictionalized headlines and quotes he had never spoken, forced to look at photographs of himself embracing colleagues presented as passionate romances. While the studio counted its millions, the human being trapped inside the armor was suffocating under a perfectly constructed corporate lie. To the movie-going public, the lifestyle of a Hollywood star appeared to be one of unimaginable luxury. Fans flipping through the pages of magazines saw sprawling estates, expensive cars, and a life of total financial freedom. However, the economic reality for young actors under the studio system was often a carefully constructed facade. Behind the gates of Warner Brothers, the relationship between the studio and the star heavily resembled a modern form of indentured servitude. While the films carrying Tab Hunter's face generated immense wealth, saving Warner Brothers from financial slumps and bringing in millions of dollars in box office revenue, the actor himself saw very little of that money. Some studio records suggest that his initial 7-year contract locked him in at a rigid salary of merely $250 a week. Even as he became the #1 box office draw in the country, his compensation remained strictly controlled by the legal parameters of his original agreement. He was generating corporate fortunes, yet he was essentially living on a working-class wage, carefully managed by his handlers. The studio executives used this financial disparity as a mechanism of total compliance. If an actor dared to show exhaustion, refused to perform a dangerous stunt, or rejected a poorly written script, the studio possessed a brutal retaliatory tool, the suspension clause. This was a standard feature of the Hollywood contract system. If the studio ordered an actor to work and the actor refused, they were immediately suspended without pay. This was not simply a loss of a weekly paycheck. A suspension carried a far more devastating consequence. During a suspension, an actor was legally barred from seeking employment anywhere else in the world. They could not film a commercial. They could not act in a stage play. And they could not work for a rival studio. Furthermore, the duration of the suspension was added to the end of their contract. If an actor held out for 6 months, their 7-year contract became a 7.5-year sentence. It was a mechanism designed to financially starve performers until their spirit broke and they returned to the soundstage. The studio held the absolute power to turn off an actor's livelihood with the flick of a pen. Yet the threat of financial ruin was only one half of the pressure cooker. The other half was a pervasive, suffocating atmosphere of surveillance. The psychological terror of the studio lot thrived on the broader paranoia of the 1950s. While the Cold War and McCarthyism dominated national headlines, a parallel state-sanctioned witch hunt known as the Lavender Scare was quietly tearing through the country. During the Lavender Scare, government agencies systematically purged gay men and women from federal employment, labeling them as security risks and moral threats. The paranoia infected every level of American society, and Hollywood, always terrified of government regulation and boycotts, was desperate to police its own ranks. The major studios operated essentially as private fiefdoms, complete with their own security forces and intelligence networks. Within this environment, the studio lot was not a safe haven. It was a panopticon. A number of film historians believe that studios actively cultivated networks of informants. Lighting technicians, makeup artists, and even fellow actors could be passing information back to the executive suites. If a young star like Tab Hunter stepped out of line, visited the wrong neighborhood, or associated with unapproved individuals, the studio's fixers would know immediately. He was forced to navigate a labyrinth of invisible tripwires. He could not trust the people he worked with. He could not speak freely in his own dressing room. The constant fear of exposure was a heavy psychological weight. If the truth about his private life leaked, he would not just lose his job. He would face complete social annihilation. He would be rendered unemployable, publicly disgraced, and legally vulnerable. The machinery of the studio system was designed to control the present and dictate the future, but it was fundamentally vulnerable to the past. No matter how much money Warner Brothers poured into manufacturing the perfect, clean-cut cowboy, they could not erase historical fact. The greatest threat to the multi-million-dollar Tab Hunter enterprise was not a rival studio or a shifting cultural trend. The threat was a single fragile piece of paper sitting in the archives of the Los Angeles Police Department. The seed of this extortion was planted on a specific night in October 1950, long before the billboards and the trademarked name. Arthur Andrew Kelm was a young, virtually unknown aspiring actor trying to navigate the complex social terrain of Los Angeles. For a gay man in the mid-20th century, the city was a hostile and dangerous landscape. Public spaces were heavily monitored by vice squads. Establishing any sense of community required extreme secrecy. Social gatherings were strictly confined to private residences, hidden behind closed doors and drawn curtains. In October of that year, The young actor attended one such private gathering in a residential home. It was meant to be a safe haven. Instead, it became the site of a profound trauma. Without warning, the sanctity of the private space was shattered. The Los Angeles police raided the house. Historical accounts of the era indicate that these raids were brutally routine. They were designed not just to enforce the law, but to humiliate and terrorize. The young men were herded together, arrested, and transported to the local precinct. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. A young man, merely seeking the company of peers, was suddenly thrust into the criminal justice system. He was fingerprinted. He was processed. His name and physical description were officially entered into the state's criminal registry. The legal outcome of the night appeared deceptively minor. The police could not prove any severe criminal acts within the private home. Therefore, they relied on a vague, catch-all charge, commonly used to penalize homosexuality during that era: disorderly conduct. The young man pleaded guilty to the misdemeanor to avoid a protracted legal battle. He paid a fine of $50. He was released. To an ordinary citizen, a $50 fine for disorderly conduct might represent a humiliating memory, a bad night, best forgotten. But Arthur Kelm was not destined to remain an ordinary citizen. He was about to be transformed into Tab Hunter. And in the context of the Hollywood industrial complex, that $50 fine was a dormant virus. This minor police report was legally lethal due to a draconian provision embedded deep within every standard Hollywood employment contract: the morality clause. Originally instituted in the 1920s following a series of high-profile Hollywood scandals, the clause was officially framed as a way to protect the industry's public image. In practice, however, it functioned as an absolute weapon of employer control. The language of the morality clause was intentionally broad and sweeping. It stipulated that if an actor committed any act that brought them into public disrepute, scandal, or ridicule, the studio had the unilateral right to terminate their contract immediately. Furthermore, the clause often dictated that if an actor's behavior offended public morals or decency, the studio could not only fire them, but also sue them for damages, forcing the actor to repay the financial losses of a ruined film. In the fiercely conservative climate of the 1950s, a criminal record implying homosexuality was the ultimate violation of public morals. Therefore, the 1950 arrest record was not just a piece of history, it was a legal trigger. It represented a fundamental breach of contract waiting to happen. As the studio pumped resources into the Tab Hunter brand, transforming him into a national idol and a lucrative asset, the stakes surrounding that hidden file grew exponentially. The more famous he became, the more devastating the potential fallout. The $50 misdemeanor morphed into a multi-million-dollar liability. The young star lived with the agonizing knowledge that this paper trail existed. He knew that the police blotter was a matter of public record, accessible to any motivated journalist or rival. He was trapped in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the past to detonate his carefully constructed present. Every time a flashbulb popped, every time a reporter asked a probing question about his private life, the memory of that police raid loomed over him. The studio had built a magnificent golden pedestal for him to stand upon, but they had unknowingly built it directly on top of a landmine. And the people who would eventually find the detonator were not his enemies, but the very men paid to protect him. The illusion of absolute control maintained by the Hollywood studios was finally shattered, not by a rival film company, but by the relentless machinery of the mid-century tabloid press. By the mid-1950s, a new and terrifying force had emerged in the American media landscape. It was called Confidential Magazine. Unlike the compliant, studio-friendly fan publications that happily printed fabricated stories of wholesome dates and innocent romance, Confidential operated on a completely different business model. Its publisher, Robert Harrison, realized that the American public was growing tired of the sanitized plastic heroes manufactured by studio public relations departments. Harrison understood that scandal, sin, and the destruction of idols sold exponentially more copies than manufactured innocence. Confidential bypassed the studio fixers entirely. They built a sprawling shadow network of private investigators, disgruntled hotel clerks, disgruntled former lovers, and corrupt police officers. They paid cash for verified secrets. In the fiercely moralistic climate of 1950s America, there was no secret more lucrative and no weapon more destructive than evidence of a major film star's homosexuality. In the autumn of 1955, the ticking time bomb finally reached zero. Confidential magazine obtained the Los Angeles Police Department arrest record from that private gathering in October 1950. They possessed the definitive legal documentation that the golden boy of American cinema, the fiercely masculine star of violent westerns, had been swept up in a vice raid and fined for disorderly conduct. The magazine prepared to run the story as a massive front-page expose. The revelation was designed to instantly annihilate his career. It would trigger the morality clause in his contract, rendering him unemployable and financially ruined. For the young actor trapped in the center of this impending catastrophe, the sheer terror of discovery was paralyzing. However, the true horror of this event was not the impending publication itself. The deepest wound was the source of the leak. The police file had not been uncovered by an intrepid investigative journalist. It had not been purchased from a corrupt desk sergeant. The weapon that was about to destroy Tab Hunter had been hand-delivered to the magazine by his own protector. The informant was Henry Wilson. This betrayal was a direct product of the cold, calculating nature of the Hollywood talent agency system. Henry Wilson was the architect of the Tab Hunter persona. He had discovered the boy, stripped him of his birth name, and molded him into a highly profitable commodity. Wilson's agency represented a stable of similarly manufactured hypermasculine stars. But among Wilson's vast inventory of human assets, one name stood above all others in terms of sheer box office dominance and financial yield. That name was Rock Hudson. Hudson was the undisputed king of the Universal Pictures lot. He was an older, more established star, and he generated astronomical profits for both his studio and for Henry Wilson. But Rock Hudson was hiding the exact same secret. Confidential magazine had acquired devastating, undeniable proof of Hudson's private life. The publisher contacted Henry Wilson with an ultimatum. The magazine was preparing to run a cover story that would obliterate Rock Hudson, taking Wilson's most valuable financial asset down with it. Faced with the imminent destruction of his primary source of income, Wilson did not hesitate. He operated not as an emotional guardian, but as a ruthless portfolio manager cutting his losses. Wilson needed a sacrificial lamb to satisfy the tabloid's appetite for destruction. He approached the publishers of Confidential and offered a diabolical trade. He promised to hand over scandalous, fully documented files on two of his other, slightly less profitable clients if the magazine agreed to bury the story on Rock Hudson. The magazine accepted the grim bargain. Wilson opened his own filing cabinets. He pulled out the arrest record of another client, Rory Calhoun, detailing his secret past in a federal penitentiary. Then Wilson pulled the 1950 Los Angeles Vice Squad file belonging to Tab Hunter. He handed these documents to the executioners to buy Hudson's safety. The betrayal was absolute. The man who had demanded total trust, who had controlled every aspect of the young actor's public and private existence, had sold him out to save a more expensive piece of property. Tab Hunter was thrown entirely to the wolves. In September 1955, the article hit the newsstands across America. The piece was vicious, mocking, and laced with undeniable legal facts regarding the arrest. Panic swept through the executive suites of Warner Brothers. According to the strict rules of the studio system, this was the exact moment the morality clause should have been activated. The studio was legally entitled to fire the actor, distance themselves from the scandal, and protect their corporate reputation. That was the standard operating procedure for any star caught in a moral panic during the Lavender Scare. But Jack Warner, the notoriously unsentimental head of the studio, paused. He did not pause out of loyalty, compassion, or sudden belief in civil rights. He paused because he looked at the studio's accounting ledgers. At that exact moment, Tab Hunter was starring in a massive, big-budget World War II epic titled Battle Cry. The film was already in theaters, and it was grossing millions of dollars. It was on its way to becoming Warner Brothers' most profitable film of the entire year. To fire the lead actor in the middle of a historic box office run would be to voluntarily sabotage the studio's own revenue stream. The financial investment was simply too large to abandon. A fascinating, cynical calculus took place in the boardroom. Jack Warner realized that while the tabloid story was damaging, firing his biggest star would cost the studio millions of dollars in lost ticket sales. Therefore, the studio executives decided to fight the scandal, not to protect the human being, but to protect the asset. Warner Brothers deployed its immense corporate power to counter the narrative. They utilized their leverage over mainstream Hollywood columnists, feeding them exclusive positive stories to drown out the tabloid noise. They accelerated the production of fake romantic photo shoots. They relied on the sheer momentum of his fame to overwhelm the truth. The strategy, shockingly, worked. The American public, largely rural and deeply invested in the manufactured illusion, chose to ignore the tabloid dirt in favor of the handsome hero on the screen. Battle Cry continued to break box office records. Tab Hunter survived the immediate professional execution. The studio had successfully shielded its investment. But the dynamic between the actor and the employer had fundamentally and permanently shifted. The crisis had been contained, but the power structure had been exposed in its most brutal form. Jack Warner had saved the actor's career, but he made sure the young man understood the exact price of that salvation. The studio had not erased the 1950 police file. They had simply taken possession of it, and Jack Warner knew exactly how to use it. The immediate aftermath of the tabloid crisis offered a fleeting, deceptive illusion of safety. As the box office receipts for Battle Cry poured into the Warner Brothers accounting department, breaking records and securing the studio's financial quarter, the young actor exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for years. The storm had seemingly passed. The American public had rejected the scandal, choosing instead to embrace the manufactured, celluloid hero they adored. The studio's aggressive counterintelligence campaign, utilizing its vast network of sympathetic columnists and staged photo opportunities, had successfully suffocated the truth. For a brief moment, the actor believed that the studio executives were his fierce protectors. He mistakenly assumed that because he generated immense wealth for the company, he had earned their loyalty. He believed they had shielded him from the destructive machinery of the mid-century press out of a mutual symbiotic partnership. He was tragically mistaken. He had merely survived an assassination attempt by the tabloids, only to realize he had been dragged into a much darker, windowless room by his own rescuers. The protection offered by Warner Brothers was never a shield. It was a tightly drawn net. The reality of his new existence was cemented not on a glamorous soundstage, but in the cold wood-paneled quiet of the executive suites. Shortly after the public relations fire was extinguished, the actor was summoned to the office of the studio head, Jack Warner. Warner was a man of legendary ruthlessness, a titan of the golden age who viewed the men and women on his payroll not as artists, but as livestock. The atmosphere in that office was heavy with unspoken threats. When the actor sat down, the dynamic shifted with brutal efficiency. There were no congratulations on the success of his latest film. There was no discussion of his future artistic development. Instead, the conversation functioned as a corporate hostage negotiation, where the hostage had already been stripped of all leverage. Jack Warner made it chillingly clear that the studio's intervention with the magazine was not an act of grace. It was a high-interest loan, and the collateral was the actor's absolute, unquestioning obedience. Warner did not need to physically produce the police file. Its invisible presence dominated the room. The studio head conveyed a simple, terrifying message. The scandal had not been erased, it had merely been purchased. Warner Brothers now effectively owned the dirt. They had absorbed the cost of managing the crisis, and in return they had acquired the ultimate weapon against their own star. If the actor ever dared to complain about his grueling schedule, if he ever demanded a salary increase commensurate with his massive box office draw, or if he ever pushed back against the studio's iron-fisted control, Warner could simply withdraw his protection. The studio could quietly leak the file themselves, instantly detonating the actor's life and career while claiming moral outrage. The mechanism of control had evolved. The actor was no longer just bound by a standard employment contract. He was trapped by systemic, state-of-the-art corporate blackmail. The rescue was, in reality, a hostile takeover of his personal agency. The immediate consequence of this weaponized leverage was a catastrophic loss of artistic control. Stripped of the right to refuse assignments, he was abruptly pushed down the production hierarchy into a grueling pipeline of B-tier movies. He was forced to churn out shallow, repetitive content, functioning merely as a disposable, high-priced prop to generate quick corporate revenue. The true depth of his captivity became agonizingly clear when a rare lifeline appeared from outside the fortress of Warner Brothers. Recognizing his undeniable screen presence and massive audience appeal, rival studio Paramount Pictures approached his handlers. Paramount was preparing a major prestigious cinematic project, and they wanted him for a leading role. This practice of studios loaning out their contracted stars to competitors was a common, highly lucrative aspect of the Golden Age system. For the actor, this offer represented a desperate gasp of oxygen. It was a chance to break the suffocating routine, to work with a new caliber of directors, and to finally engage with material that possessed genuine dramatic weight. It was an opportunity to step outside the plastic mold that Warner Brothers had locked him inside. When the Paramount offer landed on Jack Warner's desk, the studio head's response was swift, absolute, and devoid of artistic consideration. He vetoed the deal immediately. The refusal was not based on scheduling conflicts or financial terms. It was a calculated punitive measure designed to reinforce the actor's subjugation. Warner weaponized the exclusivity clause of his contract to build an impenetrable wall around his asset. He was terrified that if the actor stepped onto a different lot, breathed the air of creative collaboration, or proved his worth as a serious dramatic actor in a prestige film, he might gain the confidence to rebel. Furthermore, Warner was determined that not a single dollar of revenue generated by his star's face would ever end up in the bank accounts of a rival studio. The actor was placed in a state of strict corporate quarantine. He was forced to watch the Paramount opportunity evaporate, completely powerless to intervene in the trajectory of his own life. The realization that washed over him was paralyzing. He was not a partner in the film industry. He was not an artist. He was captive labor. The traumatic ordeal of the tabloid scandal had not freed him from the past. It had merely transferred the ownership of his darkest secret from a police filing cabinet to an executive vault. The weaponization of his personal life was total and absolute. He found himself trapped in a cinematic purgatory, working endless, exhausting hours on films he despised, generating vast fortunes to enrich the very men who held his life hostage. The golden cage had shrunk to the exact dimensions of his own body, and the studio held the only key. By the late 1950s, the tectonic plates of American entertainment were shifting violently beneath the feet of the Hollywood studio system. The undisputed supremacy of the silver screen was fracturing. A new insatiable monster had entered the American living room, the television set. Millions of families were abandoning the grand velvet-lined movie palaces to gather around the cold, bluish flicker of cathode ray tubes. The major studios, once the untouchable empires of culture, were gripped by a sudden existential panic. Box office revenues were bleeding out. To survive the television revolution, the studio bosses realized they had to conquer it. Jack Warner, a man who possessed the predatory instincts of a survivalist, immediately ordered a massive restructuring of his empire. He began converting his vast sound stages into television production factories. But to launch these new low-budget broadcasting ventures, Warner needed recognizable bait to lure the American public. He did not look for new talent. He looked at his existing inventory. He looked directly at his most famous and most deeply compromised captive asset. The mandate came down from the executive suites with the force of a gavel. Tab Hunter was ordered to transition from leading man of feature films to the star of a weekly television sitcom. Within the strict hierarchy of mid-century Hollywood, this was universally perceived as a humiliating demotion. It signaled to the entire industry that a studio believed his cinematic value was permanently depleted, removing him from the realm of massive budgets and global theatrical releases. Furthermore, the physical reality of television production in the late 1950s was a merciless, soul-crushing grind. While a feature film might take months to shoot, allowing for rehearsal and multiple takes, television was an industrial meat grinder. Actors were expected to churn out a complete episode every single week. The schedules were punishing, stretching deep into the night. The scripts were notoriously shallow, written at breakneck speed to satisfy the relentless demands of the broadcasting network. The sets were cheap, and the lighting was flat and unforgiving. For the actor, this assignment was the ultimate degradation. Warner Brothers was preparing to wring the absolute final drops of commercial equity out of the Tab Hunter brand before discarding him. However, this grueling mandate triggered a profound internal shift. The sheer physical exhaustion of living as a corporate puppet finally outweighed the paralyzing terror of the 1950 police file. He realized with cold clarity that if he walked onto that television lot, the studio would consume whatever was left of his soul. When the studio dispatchers called to confirm his call time for the television lot, the perpetually compliant, terrified young star did the unthinkable. He did not show up. He refused to report to the makeup chair. He refused to put on the wardrobe. He refused to step in front of the cameras. The production schedule, tightly wound and dependent on his presence, derailed instantly. Panic rippled through the Warner Brothers lot. Executives furiously dialed his representatives, demanding to know where their property was. But the actor had not simply overslept or fallen ill. He was initiating an act of monumental corporate heresy. For the very first time in his meticulously controlled, heavily monitored existence, Tab Hunter said the word no. He did not use this defiance to negotiate a higher weekly salary. He did not ask for a lighter shooting schedule, a larger dressing room, or a better director. He bypassed the standard Hollywood bargaining tactics entirely. Instead, he instructed his legal representatives to draft a formal, uncompromising demand. He demanded the absolute, immediate termination of his exclusive 7-year contract with Warner Brothers Pictures. He was unilaterally declaring an end to his own indentured servitude. The captive had just looked directly at the warden, refused to work, and demanded the keys to the front gate. The machinery of the studio system ground to a sudden, violent halt, setting the stage for a brutal, high-stakes collision between a desperate individual and a furious billionaire. The reaction from the executive suites of Warner Brothers was not mere disappointment. It was a volcanic eruption of corporate fury. To Jack Warner, the studio titan who viewed his actors as highly compensated livestock, the refusal of his most lucrative creation to report to work was a direct assault on the fundamental architecture of his empire. In Warner's worldview, the studio had played the role of God. They had taken a nameless, penniless stable boy, christened him, molded his physical appearance, buried his criminal record, and elevated him to the pantheon of global fame. The concept that the creation could suddenly turn around and demand emancipation from the creator was not just a breach of contract. It was an act of profound insolence. Warner did not view the actor's demand for contract termination as a starting point for renegotiation. He viewed it as a rebellion that had to be publicly and brutally crushed to maintain discipline among the rest of his captive workforce. The studio head immediately deployed the most terrifying weapon in his legal arsenal, the threat of total industry exile. Warner summoned his army of corporate attorneys and delivered an ultimatum directly to the actor's legal representatives. The studio would not grant a release. Instead, if the actor did not immediately return to the television set and resume his position as a compliant employee, Warner Brothers would file a massive lawsuit for breach of contract. In the modern era, a contract dispute is a matter of financial settlement, but in the Hollywood of the late 1950s, a breach of contract lawsuit initiated by a major studio was a death sentence. The major film studios operated essentially as an illegal cartel. If Jack Warner officially blacklisted an actor, the heads of MGM, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, and Columbia would unilaterally honor that blacklist. They would refuse to hire him, not out of solidarity, but out of a shared, desperate need to enforce the absolute power of the studio contract system. Warner made it explicitly clear if the actor fought the studio and lost, he would never stand in front of a camera again anywhere in the United States. He would be professionally erased, stripped of his livelihood, and permanently locked out of the industry that had defined his entire adult life. This threat was designed to induce absolute psychological paralysis. Jack Warner knew about the deeply ingrained fear that had ruled the young man's life since the 1950 police raid. He expected the actor to crumble instantly under the weight of this new terror, to issue a groveling public apology, and to obediently return to his dressing room. However, Warner fundamentally misunderstood the transformation that had occurred within his captive. The actor had already looked into the abyss of his own soul and realized that a life spent as a terrified, exhausted puppet on a low-budget television set was a fate worse than professional obscurity. The fear of the studio's wrath, which had successfully controlled him for nearly a decade, suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. The actor informed his attorneys that he would not back down. He would face the lawsuit. He was prepared to let the entire empire burn to the ground if it meant he could finally walk out of the ashes as a free man. Faced with an unprecedented stalemate and realizing that a protracted, highly public legal battle could inadvertently expose the studio's own dirty tactics and the actor's hidden past to the tabloids, Jack Warner pivoted. He decided to employ a tactic of financial humiliation. If the actor wanted his freedom, Warner decreed, he would have to buy it. The studio head named his price for the termination of the exclusive contract. The figure he demanded was $100,000, payable immediately in cash. To comprehend the sheer malice of this demand, one must look at the predatory economics of the studio system. Warner knew exactly how much money his star had been paid because his own accounting department wrote the checks. For years, the actor had generated tens of millions of dollars in theatrical revenue, yet he had been tied to an initial contract that paid him a working-class wage of roughly $250 a week. Even as his salary incrementally increased in the later years of his contract, A massive percentage of his earnings had been heavily taxed by the government, siphoned off by his predatory agent Henry Wilson, and drained by the mandatory costs of maintaining the extravagant public lifestyle required of a Hollywood idol. Studio executives deliberately kept their stars in a state of financial dependency, knowing that an actor with an empty bank account could not afford to stage a rebellion. Jack Warner set the price at $100,000 because he firmly believed it was an impossible sum. It was not a genuine negotiation. It was a psychological weapon designed to conclusively prove to the actor that he was trapped, powerless, and financially incapable of surviving without the studio's patronage. But Jack Warner had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed that his star had fallen victim to the same financial recklessness that destroyed so many young actors of that era. He assumed the money had been squandered on lavish Hollywood parties, imported sports cars, and sprawling estates. He did not realize that the actor had inherited the strict, deeply ingrained financial prudence of his German immigrant mother. Throughout the years of his grueling servitude, while his peers were burning through their paychecks, he had been quietly, systematically hoarding his earnings. He lived relatively modestly away from the flashbulbs. He understood that his fame was a fragile, manufactured illusion, and he had treated every dollar he earned as a potential escape hatch. When the extortionate demand of $100,000 was delivered, the actor did not panic. He simply went to the bank. He liquidated his life savings, draining his accounts to gather the exact sum. He obtained a certified cashier's check. The moment that followed stands as one of the most remarkable yet least discussed acts of defiance in the history of the Hollywood studio system. The young actor, completely alone and without the protection of the vast publicity machinery that usually surrounded him, walked into the executive suites of Warner Brothers. He bypassed the panicked fixers and the aggressive talent agents. He walked directly into the office of the men who had owned him, controlled him, and blackmailed him. Without a word of apology or capitulation, he reached into his jacket and placed the certified check for $100,000 flat on the mahogany desk. The transaction that took place in that room was completely unprecedented. It was not merely the settlement of a legal dispute or the buyout of a labor contract. It was an act of personal redemption bought with hard currency. With that single piece of paper, the actor purchased his own emancipation from the corporate assembly line, but more profoundly, he purchased the legal rights to his own identity. The money forced Warner Brothers to relinquish their trademark. He bought back the name Tab Hunter. He was no longer a piece of intellectual property licensed to a film studio. He had successfully used the financial fruits of his own exploitation to literally buy himself back from his masters. He walked out of the studio gates that afternoon, leaving behind the empire that had built him, sacrificing the protective shield of the Hollywood machine, but carrying with him the one thing he had been denied since the day he was discovered: absolute ownership of his own life. When the heavy iron gates of the Warner Brothers lot closed behind him that afternoon, the young actor had triggered a seismic shockwave throughout the Hollywood establishment. No star of his magnitude had ever successfully weaponized their own exploited earnings to buy their way out of a standard studio contract. It was a terrifying precedent for the studio bosses. If one actor could sever the chains of the exclusivity system with a cashier's check, the entire indentured labor model of the Golden Age was suddenly vulnerable. He had proven that the absolute power of the studio could, in fact, be broken. However, the immediate reality of his victory was deeply isolating. He had won the battle for his identity, but he had stepped out of a highly fortified castle into a barren, unforgiving wilderness. He no longer had the massive Warner Brothers publicity department orchestrating his public image. He no longer had the studio fixers to bury his secrets or manage the press. He was, for the first time in his adult life, completely exposed. Meanwhile, back inside the wood-paneled executive suites of Warner Brothers, Jack Warner's reaction was chillingly pragmatic. There was no mourning for the departure of a generational talent. There was no period of reflection regarding the ruthless tactics that had driven their most profitable star to abandon them. The Hollywood studio machine was entirely devoid of sentiment. It was an industrial plant focused solely on quarterly revenue. Warner treated the loss of his lead actor exactly like a factory foreman dealing with a jammed gear. The machine did not stop, it simply recalibrated. The studio executives immediately opened their casting files and pulled out the next dossier. They needed a replacement, and they needed it instantly to fulfill their production schedules. They selected a new, unknown young actor named Troy Donahue. The physical similarities were not a coincidence. They were a corporate requirement. Like his predecessor, Donahue possessed the requisite blonde hair, the athletic build, and the highly marketable, clean-cut American look. More importantly, Donahue was young, inexperienced, and ready to sign a standard, tightly controlled studio contract. He was a fresh, compliant asset. Warner Brothers did not attempt to build a new brand for Troy Donahue. Instead, they ruthlessly plugged him directly into the exact same machinery that had just been vacated. The studio assigned Donahue the same types of scripts. They put him in the same wardrobe. They launched the exact same aggressive marketing campaigns, feeding his image to the same teenage fan magazines. They even assigned him to the same fabricated public romances to build his heterosexual profile. The transition was seamless, brutal, and entirely calculated. This swift, clinical replacement laid bare the darkest truth of the Hollywood illusion. The stars were not irreplaceable deities, but interchangeable plastic components on an industrial assembly line. For the man watching from the outside, seeing a younger, cheaper version of himself inheriting the exact same manufactured adoration was a profound psychological reckoning. It validated his escape, proving with absolute certainty that the studio would have eventually discarded him the exact same way the moment his box office returns dipped. His act of rebellion had successfully broken the monopoly over his own life, but the industry exacted a heavy toll. The major studios, operating as an unofficial cartel, locked him out to broadcast a clear warning to other actors. Life outside the system was a professional wasteland. Forced to rebuild from the ground up, he navigated the grueling terrain of live dinner theater and low-budget European spaghetti westerns just to keep working. The Hollywood establishment viewed this as a tragedy, a cautionary tale of a star who foolishly threw away his crown. But they measured success strictly in box office receipts. To the man himself, this era was not a fall from grace. It was the hard-won reality of a working professional. He was finally choosing his own roles, negotiating his own contracts, and most importantly, clocking out at the end of the day to live a life that belonged solely to him. Decades later, he dismantled his manufactured image entirely. In 1981, he starred in John Waters' countercultural film, Polyester, proving he was no longer a hostage to the conservative Tab Hunter brand. Finally, in 2005, he published his autobiography, Tab Hunter Confidential, confirming his sexuality and exposing the studio's oppressive system. Retreating from Hollywood, Arthur Kelms spent his final years pursuing his genuine passion for horses in Santa Barbara with his partner of over 30 years. He passed away in July 2018 at the age of 86. The classic Westerns he left behind are not just symbols of American invincibility. They are the records of a man who ultimately traded his Hollywood crown for the fundamental right to own his own life.